Hey there, welcome back to my channel. I'm Alicia. Today we're going to be going over all of the books that I ended up reading in January. So without any further ado, let's get right into the video. So January was a pretty strong start to the year for me. I ended up actually reading 10 books, which I didn't think would be possible. I thought I was going to end up reading like maybe 2 or 3 at most, just because it felt like a really short month and a lot of things were going on. There was one book that really put me in a book hangover. It was a book that I really loved, and right after finishing it, all I wanted to do was reread that book over and over and over again. I didn't even want to start any other book, but I also wanted to stick to my reading plans in January. But you know what? I ended up getting out of my book hangover and picking up other books that I really quite enjoyed. So I will briefly go over my stats, and then after that, we'll move on to the books that I DNF'd or didn't finish, and then we'll move on to the books that I read. So let's start off with the genres that I read. So I did read 2 mystery books, 2 thriller books, 1 literary or translated work, 1 historical fiction, 2 fantasy, 1 horror, and 1 nonfiction book. Out of all of these books, 1 of them was a reread for me. Now, in terms of star rating, and this might change for one book, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, I think I want to rate it something else. But as it stands now, 3 books were 5-star reads for me. 1 book was a 4.5-star read for me. 2 books were 4-star reads for me. 2 books were 3.5-star reads for me, and 2 books were 3-star reads for me. So in terms of format, out of the 10 books that I read, 3 of them were audiobooks that I got through the Libby app. The other 7 were physical books. 5 of those books came from my shelves, and the other 2 were library books. So I guess with that, let's start off with the book that I ended up DNFing in January. And let's just say it was an entire journey with this book, and this is The Gunslinger by Stephen King. And when I tell you that I really tried my best to get into this book, I'm not kidding. I picked up this physical copy. I wasn't really feeling it. I was very confused, and there was nothing that really hooked me to propel me to keep going. And I thought maybe it's because it's a really old edition, and I know that Stephen King has a newer edition and that he changed the language to be a little bit more modern. So I was like, you know what? It's okay, I'm gonna put this one down and I'm gonna try it in an audiobook format. Because usually when I have trouble getting into a book, if I start off with the audiobook and get a feeling for it, then I'm able to come back to the physical book once I'm invested. So I tried the audiobook. It wasn't working for me. I don't know what it was about the audiobook, but I found myself drifting, and usually that's not the case because usually I listen to audiobooks when I'm at the gym or when I'm doing chores, things that don't really require my full attention. But with The Gunslinger specifically, I often found my mind drifting, and I would listen to 20 minutes of this audiobook and all of a sudden I was like, I don't know what's going on. So I put the audiobook down, and so then I actually ended up picking up the newer version of The Gunslinger because for some reason we have both editions. I just can't find it right now. I don't know where we left it. And I ended up running into that same problem where I just couldn't continue. I don't think I made it past page 100. I don't know. There was something about it. It might have also been though that I was in that book hangover that I was talking about, and just any book that I tried wasn't really doing it for me. I wasn't really invested. I just wanted to reread the other book. So we might give it another try in March and see how it goes. Okay, so now let's get into the fun part, which is the books that I actually ended up finishing and reading for the month of January. I'm going to be really brief on this one because I have an entire dedicated gushing review about it and how much I loved it. If I had to choose a favorite read of January, this would be the book, and this is Warbreaker by Brenda Sanderson. This is currently a fantasy standalone. And I do say currently because this book is going to be expanded into a series. We don't know when the books are going to come out yet, but as of now, it is a standalone. It's one that I just freaking adored. And what I really loved about Warbreaker in particular is that it has all of the things that you would expect from a Brandon Sanderson book. Fantastic world building, a spectacular magic system. But on top of that, these characters just bled with personality. They're some of the most fun characters that I've read about. So yes, if you're looking for a fantasy standalone and you want to try adult fantasy, this is one that I would definitely recommend to pick up. It's one that also has this very interesting concept because most of the fantasy books that I read, you're thrown in right at the beginning of a conflict and you know that there's an impending war coming, and so you follow people who are either the rebels or the king, and so you really follow characters where you're trying to propel the war forward, whereas in this book you follow characters who are trying to stop war from happening. So I thought that was a unique perspective, and I think it really worked with this. So those are my brief thoughts on Warbreaker. Highly recommend, my favorite book of January. I thought I would go ahead and tell you about the second fantasy book that I ended up reading in the month of January, and that is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. So actually, Gods of Jade and Shadow is a reread for me. The first time I read it back in 2019, I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. And the reason I gave it an okay rating back then was because I'm really interested in the storyline between Cassiopeia and Vukum Kame. If you don't know what this book is about, it is a quest. So the majority of the time we're following Cassiopeia, who is our main character, and the Mayan god of death called Vukum Kame. We're following both of them after Cassiopeia accidentally unleashes him from this chest in which he has been imprisoned, and so they have to go on a quest to restore his full self. That way he can take back his kingdom and get revenge from his brother who imprisoned him in the first place. So on a reread, I actually ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars, and the reason for that is that I already knew the storyline, I already knew what was going to happen, so I could really just focus on the details and on the writing. Silvia Moreno Garcia's prose is beautiful, and the second time around I was able to really focus on enjoying the writing, but also on these little extra details that are part of her world building in here that really came to life. What I particularly liked about Gods of Jade and Shadow the second time around is that it kind of felt like I was sitting by a nice cozy fireplace or around a bonfire, and it felt like a family member or a very dear close friend was telling me the story, but also inserting little facts and histories about Mexico. This is set during 1920s Mexico. Since it is a quest, we do get to hit a couple of different cities in Mexico and learn a little bit more about their background and their history, and I just found that extremely fascinating the second time around. I would say that if you like myths and folklore, and if you like quest stories, and you've been wanting to get into adult fantasy, I would suggest that this is the perfect place to start. By the way, this was the January book club pick for Brujas in Books. They did have a live show, so I will go ahead and link that down below in case you want to hear other perspectives on this book. The next 2 books on this list are thrillers, and similarly to Warbreaker, I'll only give you my brief thoughts. I already talked about them in a different video where I talk about if these thrillers are worth picking up, so I will link that video down below. The first book is Razorblade Tears, and this is by S.A. Cosby. This is a thriller that is very fast-paced, very action-heavy, and very plot-driven. So if you like those kinds of things, this is one that I would actually check out because, again, it delivers on all of that. On top of that, we follow 2 fathers who are looking for redemption and revenge against the death of their 2 gay sons. They were murdered, and after the police ran out of leads, these 2 unlikely fathers who have nothing in common end up banding together and seeking justice for their kids. This was a book that I really enjoyed my reading experience of. It was one, again, that was fast-paced, and I was really engaged with the plot the entire time. I do, however, want to point out that this book is laced with misogyny, homophobic, and transphobic comments, so I do want to make you aware of that right off the bat. The next thriller that I read that is also in that video is The Other Black Girl, and this is by Zakiya Dalila Harris. Now, this is an office thriller, and it's one that isn't as fast-paced as Razorblade Tears. I would say that the first 60 to 70% of the book is actually very slow-paced, and although there are these incremental, very small little pockets of tension that are building up, if you're someone who really likes fast-paced plots, I think this is one that might bore you a little bit. So in this one, we're following Nella, and she works at this really big publishing house called Wagner. Now, for years, Nella has been trying to get Wagner to adopt a bunch of different diversity initiatives to get more people that look like her to work in the office, to get more diversity, to get more representation. That has largely been ignored all these years. And so Nella is really excited when another black girl, hence the title, called Hazel, is hired on board. She thinks, yes, finally they're listening to my pleas and we're gonna get the ball rolling. But then all of a sudden she starts getting all of these weird notes and messages asking her to leave Wagner. And at first she thinks it's a prank and she ignores them, but then we find out that there's something really nefarious going on here. So if that sounds really interesting to you, this is one that again moves really slow, but I think it has really good payoff at the end. I would say that if you liked When No One Is Watching, you would probably like this one as well. The next two books that I'm going to talk about are both mystery books. The first one of those is The Maid by Nita Prose, and this is the book that I was talking about in the beginning of the video, that the more I think about it, the more I kind of want to change my rating. So I did initially give this book 4 out of 5 stars. It was one that, again, I actually really enjoyed the reading experience of. It was one that really did keep me engaged, and it was because I really liked our main character, Molly. But if I sit down and really think about what this book did and the genre that it's in, I would have to dock it a star or at least half a star. So I would actually say that this is like a 3 to a 3.5 star mystery book. And the reason for that is because The Maid tries to do a lot, so much that at different points in time, I felt like I was reading 3 entirely separate books that were bound together into this one physical book. There are significant tonal shifts throughout the book, and I feel like if you're someone who picked up this book just for the mystery element, you might be a little bit disappointed. Hey there, this is Editing Alicia. Tragedy struck, so some of my original footage was erased, and I don't know how it happened. I did notice it when I was originally filming, but I thought it was only for one particular book. So I did refilm that section, but I didn't realize that it also erased half of The Maid review. So I guess to briefly sum up my thoughts on The Maid is that the mystery element wasn't really the focus of the book. The focus of the book was really on Molly and Molly's character. So if you're someone who is picking that book up for the mystery, you're going to be really disappointed unless you end up really liking Molly's character. And I just already know that she's going to be a character that you either love or hate, because Molly is a character that isn't quite attuned to social interactions, and sometimes she doesn't read well into situations. So as a reader, that's either going to really frustrate you because something that is very obvious to us isn't going to be obvious to her. I found those moments endearing and also a little bit comical. So I personally really liked Molly. But another thing that I wanted to point out is that Molly is also dealing with a lot of grief. Her grandma had recently passed away, and her grandma was her best friend. And so Molly has never really allowed herself to grieve her grandmother's death. She threw herself into her work, and she doesn't even want to spend too much time at home because it reminds her too much of her grandmother. And so a lot of the book is also focused on that. And that's what I mean when I say that there's significant tonal shifts, because it goes from like a very lighthearted, comedic, borderline funny murder mystery, and then all of a sudden it has a very sad tone because Molly is grieving. I just realized that I haven't told you what this book is about. So in this one, we're following a neurodivergent character. Her name is Molly, and she's working at the Grand Regency Hotel. She loves working there because she knows how she fits into this cog that is the hotel, and she takes a lot of pride in being a maid. She knows how to do her job, and she knows exactly how to do it. She doesn't have to second guess herself here because she knows where she fits in. And so one day, a very high-profile guest ends up being murdered in his suite, and because of the way that Molly interacts with the world, she is automatically deemed a person of interest. And so we follow her along with some friends trying to help her out to find the real culprit behind this. So to sum it up, I really like The Maid, but because of all of the elements, I would actually say it's more of a contemporary or literary fiction book rather than just a straightforward murder mystery. I think for a debut, it's well written, but at times it did also feel like this author really wanted to tackle so many different things and then didn't know how to make it one cohesive work. So now that I've had even more days to digest, I would definitely say this is a solid 3-star book, and that I would pick up more things by Nita Prose because I do like her writing, and I did like the twist at the end. It was just a book that needed a lot more editing and a little bit more cohesion. So that is The Maid. So the next mystery that I ended up reading in the month of January is A Midnight Summer's Dream, and this is by Keigo Higashino, which is translated by Alexander O. Smith from Japanese to English, and this is part of the Detective Galileo series that I've been slowly reading. I'm slowly trying to read through all of Keigo Higashino's stories. I really love his mysteries. I think what I really love about them is that there's this really big emphasis not only on science and the scientific process, but equally on these morally gray scenarios. Not every everything in the world is right or wrong, and he really introduces those nuanced scenarios into these cozy mystery novels, which I really enjoy. And so in this one, we're following Yukawa, who is our detective Galileo. He is a physicist that occasionally helps the Tokyo Police Department in some unsolvable, really complicated type of mysteries. And in this one, he ends up going to Hari Cove, which is this very small city on the coast. He was brought in by this larger corporation that is working to undertake a mining operation in this little city. Yukawa is brought in to talk about this new technology that might prevent disruption of the seafloor and of sea animals and stuff like that for this mining operation. Now, while on his way to Hari Cove, Yukawa ends up meeting this little boy who tells him he's going to his aunt's and uncle's hotel for the summer, and Yukawa ends up going to that hotel as well. Now, where the mystery really takes off is that at that same hotel, we have a retired police officer from the Tokyo Police Department that is staying there, and then he is murdered under suspicious circumstances. And so again, we have Yukawa helping the Tokyo Police Department figure out why this retired police officer was killed. This was such a cozy mystery read for me. Again, it's one that I really enjoyed. If you're someone who is very data driven, who likes math and physics, I think this is one you'll really enjoy, just because the scientific process is always very integral to these plots. And then you have Yukawa's character, who really introduces a lot of humanity to these plots, a lot of nuance around morally gray scenarios. It's one that I really enjoyed. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. So that was A Midnight Summer's Equation. The next book on this list is Loop by Brenda Lozano. This was translated from Spanish to English by Annie McDermott, and this was my selection for reading a Mexican author for my Reading Latin American Authors reading project. If you're like, wait, what the heck is that? Don't worry, I'll leave the video link down below. In February, we are reading books by Argentinian authors, so if you want to participate, there's still time. And then in March, we're reading Cuban authors. So feel free to join if you like. I've created a spreadsheet down below in case you're having trouble finding authors, which will always be linked in every description box of every video. So back to Loop by Brenda Lozano. This is one that I'm not gonna lie, I struggled a little bit with it. It's one that I had really mixed feelings about. So I started to read it, and then at some point I was like, I'm not really understanding, or I'm not really riveted right now, so let me put it down and come back later. But then I would end up reading just one line that would suck me back in, and then all of a sudden I was interested again. And that process just kept happening over and over and over until I was at the end of the book. So it was literally a book that always kept me on the edge, because I was always on the verge of, I don't really know what this is about, and I don't know if I want to continue, and then all of a sudden I'm extremely invested in what's going on. Let me try to explain in loose terms what this book is about. We're really following an unnamed narrator as she's waiting for the return of her boyfriend. The format of the actual book and the writing and narrative structure is what I would consider experimental. It has these cyclical ways of presenting themes, hence the title Loop. And really at the core of it, we're following these fragmented thoughts and very subtle observations of this unnamed narrator. So even though I would say that the writing is actually very digestible, very easy to read, the cyclical format of the narrative, along with this sort of stream of consciousness writing, made it at times a little bit difficult for me to personally digest. And that's just because I don't read a lot of stream of consciousness. So if you do like stream of consciousness, I think that you should pick up this book, because it is refreshing and it is witty and it is different. And I really enjoyed small pockets of this, but it was just the stream of consciousness that prevented me from loving it. The other thing I want to point out is that it's filled with literary references galore, especially about the Odyssey and the Iliad. So if you're someone that loves both of those works, I would also recommend for you to pick it up, because I feel like you would get a lot more out of it than I did. When I tell you that it's been decades since I've read both the Odyssey and the Iliad, I'm not lying. And because of that, I also didn't quite understand the connection between the books. So if you're looking for something that is very clever and refreshing and something that is a little bit outside of your comfort zone, maybe give this one a try, because it's one where I really did find small pockets of enjoyment. But again, the stream of consciousness and then the literary references to these epic poems that I haven't read in such a long time prevented me from loving it. So yes, that was Loop by Brenda Lozano. The next book on this list is Eloquent Rage by Brittney Cooper, and it is a collection of feminist essays that really center Black women, Black girl magic, and Black feminism. This, y'all, was another 5-star read, and I know I already said that Warbreaker was my favorite book of January. Well, this was my favorite nonfiction of January. And yes, granted, I only read one nonfiction in January, but I can see this essay collection being on my top 10 of the year. It was that freaking amazing. So I would recommend Eloquent Rage specifically to people who want to deepen their feminist thinking. The essays in here range from Black love to respectability topics to white girl tears. And what I really loved about this collection is that, again, it really centers Black women at the core of it. It really highlights the experience of Black women being placed into this very small confined box that they can't really get out of, because if they try to step out of it, they're the angry Black woman. If they decide to do everything by themselves, they're too independent and don't know how to ask for help. But then if they do try to ask for help, then they're all of a sudden labeled welfare queens. This essay collection was just so raw and so powerful, and is also one that is unflinching. So if you're looking, again, to deepen your feminist thinking, or if you're looking for a book with a narrative that centers Black women, this is an excellent one. The next two books on this list I actually ended up getting from the library. So the first one of those is a historical fiction novel, and this is The Yellow Wife by Sadeqa Johnson. I want to stop right here before I keep going and just give you some content warnings, because I wasn't expecting a lot of the things that were in this book. If you look at the cover of the book, you don't really see it going to where it goes. There is graphic depiction of slavery, including whippings, repeated rape, and torture. So please keep that in mind before going in, because some scenes in here I will never be able to get out of my mind, and that's not a good thing. I had to look the other way while reading, but I couldn't because I was reading. So I guess let me start off by saying that this is not an easy read, but I think it is a necessary one. I picked up this book because I think it's necessary for us to read about the antebellum South and to read slave narratives to combat the revisionist history that we are taught in school. At least the revisionist history that was taught at my school. So The Yellow Wife was actually based on the story of Mary Lumpkin, who was an imprisoned sex slave to Robert Lumpkin, and he was notorious for quote unquote breaking slaves. Like, the acts that he committed are just unspeakable. They are horrendous. They are terrible. And so in The Yellow Wife, we are primarily following our main character called Phoebe Brown. She was born in a plantation to her mother, who was a slave, and she was the daughter of the plantation owner. Now, the plantation owner's sister took really kindly to Phoebe, and so she was actually protected through some of her childhood years. She didn't really get to experience the brutality of slavery during those first few years because she was sheltered by her father. This does not go very well with his white wife, and when the plantation owner dies, Phoebe is sold off into slavery. And this is really where she first starts to experience the brutality of slavery itself. She realizes little things like being able to read can get her in a lot of trouble. And really, this is a narrative that is really unique because it follows the experiences of biracial women in slavery and the different coping mechanisms that they had to use in order to survive. Again, not an easy read, but it's one that is a necessary one, and it was extremely well written. It was a 4.5 out of 5-star read for me. I know I feel like this video is going to be ages long, but we have one more book to talk about, and that is When the Reckoning Comes by LaTanya McQueen. This is a horror book, and it was fantastic. This was another 5-star read for me. It's another book that does tackle racism and violence and injustice and slavery in the antebellum South. It's one that there are also parts of it that are difficult to read, but again, necessary. But what I think LaTanya McQueen does so effortlessly in this book is to weave these narratives along with this great storyline that is part haunted house. It's really spooky. Parts of it feel hallucinogenic. It was great. Just the vibes and the atmosphere were So in this one, we're following Mia, and she had long ago abandoned her childhood and the segregated town that she used to live in. But then all of a sudden, her childhood friend, who is white, ends up inviting her back to this town where she's getting married at this restored plantation. Yes, you heard it, restored plantation. And so Mia doesn't really want to come back. She definitely doesn't want to go back to that plantation because something happened there when she was a little girl that scared the shit out of her. So she's like, no, don't really want to go. And so this plantation is rumored to be haunted and to be filled with the souls of prior slaves who want revenge. And this is where the wedding is taking place. When I tell you that the atmosphere was... The story itself is a little bit slow to get started, but LaTanya does this excellent job of really weaving in these flashbacks into the tapestry of the story that there really isn't ever a dull moment in the story, even though it is slower to get started. The writing was spectacular and the storytelling was just out of this world. So highly recommend When the Reckoning Comes. So that was it. Those are all of the books that I ended up reading in the month of January. If you like my content, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell. It is the best way that you can support me. Thanks again, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!